Have you ever had the feeling that someone was watching you, even though you couldn't see who it was? That uncomfortable feeling that seems to have no explanation, but that leaves you restless? That was exactly what Johnny Depp felt that day. After months of living through one of the most talked about trials in the world, he just wanted peace. But sitting in a discreet cafe, he would soon realize that the tranquility he sought so much was about to be interrupted. And what he still didn't know was that that encounter would completely change his perception of the trial he experienced. It was a cold, gray morning in New York. The cafe in which Johnny Depp was sitting was on an inconspicuous street, away from the spotlight and harassment from the press. He was wearing a dark coat, a cap, and dark glasses, the typical look he wore to avoid being recognized. Johnny didn't want attention that day. He just wanted to enjoy his coffee and reflect on the difficult months he had faced. Since the end of the lawsuit against Amber Heard, he had been trying to get his life back on track. The case, which exposed his personal life to the entire world, still echoed in the media and social networks. Johnny Depp knew it was a name that no one would easily forget, so he wasn't surprised when he realized someone was looking at him. At the table next to the window, there was a man who kept staring at Johnny. He tried to hide it, but his insistent look revealed that there was something strange. Johnny tried to ignore it. He thought it might just be a shy fan, or maybe someone trying to confirm that it was really the actor who was there. But there was something different about that look. The man didn't just seem curious. He looked tense. After a few minutes, Johnny decided to act. He took off his sunglasses and looked straight at the man. Normally, this gesture was enough for fans to back away or come closer to ask for a photo. But that man didn't move. He continued staring, and it was then that Johnny noticed something even stranger. He knew that face. Johnny's mind started working fast. That man wasn't just any fan. He had seen that face before. Johnny closed his eyes for a moment, trying to remember. It was then that he realized. It was the judge who had presided over her trial against Amber Heard. The surprise was instantaneous. What was that man doing there? Johnny tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a work trip, or even a curiosity of fate. But deep down, he knew this was no coincidence. Minutes later, the judge stood up and began to walk slowly towards the table where Johnny was. The actor remained calm, but inside I was alert. "Can I sit down?" asked the judge, with an unreadable expression. Johnny crossed his arms and nodded slightly. "It seems like I don't have much of a choice, does it?" The judge smiled restrainedly and pulled out the chair. He settled down and remained silent for a few seconds, as if searching for the right words. "I know this isn't the best place for this, but I needed to talk to you." Johnny kept his gaze fixed. He didn't trust that man. During the trial, the judge had always maintained a cool and professional demeanor, exactly as expected of someone in charge of a courtroom. So why was he here now, acting so personal? "Did you follow me here?" Johnny asked, with a serious tone. The judge shook his head. "No, I needed to find you. It's something that couldn't wait." "Why?" The judge hesitated. He took a deep breath, took his glasses off his face, and rubbed his hands nervously. "Because," he began, looking into Johnny's eyes, "there's something you need to know, something that happened during the trial, and that could change the way you see everything." Johnny narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean by that?" The judge leaned forward a little more, lowering his voice. "I received pressure during the trial, and it wasn't just public pressure. It was something more serious, something that made me fear the consequences if I didn't obey." Johnny's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about? Who pressured you?" The judge took another deep breath, but before answering, he pulled a crumpled envelope from his inside jacket pocket and placed it on the table. "This might give you some answers." Johnny looked at the envelope and instinctively didn't want to take it right away. He knew that whatever was in there could change everything. "What is that?" Johnny asked. The judge looked at him with a serious expression and replied, "It's the reason I haven't slept well since your trial ended. Have you ever felt like someone was hiding something important from you? Something that could completely change the way you see a situation?" That's exactly how Johnny Depp felt when looking at that envelope on the table. He knew that, inside that folded and crumpled paper, there was something serious, something that the judge had carried with him since the end of the trial. But before Johnny could open the envelope, the judge spoke. "Before you see this, I need to tell you something." The judge, still visibly uncomfortable, took a deep breath and began to explain. "During the trial, I tried to maintain the professional posture that my position requires. But what you don't know is that I was dealing with a complicated situation outside of court." Johnny didn't look away. He hung on every word. "What kind of situation?" Johnny asked, trying to remain calm. The judge hesitated, as if searching for courage to say what he needed. "I was being pressured." Johnny leaned across the table, intrigued. "Pressured by whom?" "By people close to Amber Heard." Johnny frowned. "People nearby? Are you saying someone tried to influence the outcome of the trial?" "I can't prove it," replied the judge. "But what I know is that during the process, I received messages and warnings that made it clear to me that there were people very interested in manipulating my decision." Johnny crossed his arms, still suspicious. "And you just telling me this now?" The judge took a deep breath. "I had no other choice." Johnny still didn't look convinced. "How do you know these people were connected to Amber?" The judge rested his elbows on the table and lowered his voice. "Because one of the warnings I received came from a lawyer who had direct connections to her, a man named Eric Jensen." Johnny was silent for a few seconds. Eric Jensen, he had been a discreet figure in the process, but not completely unknown. During the trial, he worked as part of Amber's legal counsel, working behind the scenes and avoiding the spotlight. "I thought it was strange at the time, but I couldn't prove anything," continued the judge. "And to be honest, I was scared." "Afraid of what?" Johnny asked, now even more intrigued. The judge let out a heavy sigh. "Fear that this would go beyond simple judicial pressure and that it would start to affect my family." The judge then said that, during the trial, he had begun to notice strange signs. "One night, when I left the courtroom, I realized I was being followed. A black car followed me for almost 20 minutes until I finally turned onto a busy street and it disappeared." Johnny listened carefully, and then the tickets started. "Tickets?" Johnny repeated. "Yes, little papers left in my mailbox, notes that looked like disguised warnings. Messages like, 'You better know how to choose the right side. There is no way back from certain mistakes.'" Johnny sat back in his chair, taking in every detail. "And you didn't think about reporting at the time?" "I thought," replied the judge, "but it was my word against nothing. There was no evidence, there were no cameras, there were no witnesses. If I had said something in those days, it might seem like I was trying to manipulate the trial decision itself." Johnny finally picked up the envelope on the table and began to open it. Inside, he found a folded note already yellowed with age. The message said, "Decide well, or your career will be the next to end." Johnny looked up. "Was this left at your house?" The judge nodded. "The same day, I finished the jury instructions. The letter was in my mailbox, no sender, no explanation." Johnny read the sentence again. The words were few, but they carried a clear thread and showed that there was much more going on behind the scenes of that trial than the public had ever known. "Do you believe someone was trying to destroy me from the start?" Johnny asked, his voice firmer. The judge kept his gaze down, almost embarrassed. "I believe there were people who didn't want you to have a chance to defend yourself, and were willing to do anything to ensure that." Johnny placed the note on the table and looked at the judge. "And why are you telling me this now?" The judge hesitated, but then replied, "Because," his voice trailed off for a moment, "I had to choose between keeping my reputation intact or running the risk of exposing all of this. And you chose to protect yourself," added Johnny with a hard tone. The judge did not try to justify himself. He just nodded slowly. "I came here because I needed you to know the truth. And because," he took a deep breath, "I can't sleep with this guilt anymore." "And you? What would you do if you were in Johnny Depp's shoes? How would you react when you found out that someone knew the truth and chose to remain silent?" Comment here. And if you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to follow more content like this. Have you ever felt that even after winning a difficult battle, something was still wrong? Something that was unresolved and that, deep down, seemed incomplete? This feeling took over Johnny Depp as you hold that little note in your hands. The words were few, but heavy. Decide well, or your career will be the next to end. The cards were finally starting to fall into place. Throughout the trial against Amber Heard, Johnny felt something was out of place, and now he knew why. That threat wasn't just a warning. It was proof that there was something much bigger happening behind the scenes. The note was still on the table when Johnny broke the silence. Why didn't you talk about this before? The judge sighed deeply, resting his elbows on the table and pressing his hands to his face. Because, he began hesitantly, I was afraid it would destroy not only my career, but my family. Johnny remained serious, awaiting further explanation. At that time, there was immense pressure on the case, continued the judge. It was impossible to escape the media, impossible not to see the headlines every day. Public opinion was divided, and regardless of my decision, someone would come out saying that everything was manipulated. And was it manipulated? Johnny interrupted with a hard look. The judge hesitated. Not directly, he replied. The court's decisions were made in accordance with the law, but that does not mean there were no attempts at interference. Johnny shook his head, and you let it happen. The judge tried to respond, but his voice broke. He took a deep breath and started again. I received this note shortly before I gave the final instructions to the jury. At that moment, I was mentally exhausted. He pointed to the note on the table. I didn't know if it was just an attempt at intimidation or something really serious. And to be honest, I didn't want to risk finding out. The judge then revealed that during the weeks leading up to the verdict, he received several signs that something was going on behind the scenes. Small Blue Diamond, a mysterious person, tried to contact him in the court corridors. Small Blue Diamond, the lawyer Eric Jensen, who had ties to Amber Heard's circle, was seen several times discreetly talking to people who were not officially part of the defense. Small Blue Diamond, one of his assistants, reported that suspicious phone calls were made to the judge's office, where a distorted voice said phrases such as, "Choose your words carefully, or you will pay dearly." Johnny leaned forward, now fully alert. "And you didn't think to call the police?" The judge nodded. "I thought, but without concrete proof, all I had was coincidences. And in court, coincidences mean nothing if they're not accompanied by facts." Johnny still wasn't convinced. "Why do you think these threats were made to protect Amber? It may have just been an attempt to intimidate you in any way." "It wasn't just that," replied the judge. "I discovered that, at the time, some people close to Amber's team were in contact with specific journalists. These journalists were preparing stories that claimed you had bought the judge if the verdict was in your favor." Johnny's eyes widened. "Would it try to frame me even if I won?" "Yes," confirmed the judge. "Their intention was simple. If you won, they would tarnish your victory. If you lost, they would celebrate." Johnny took a deep breath, processing that revelation. "So either way, I would lose." "That was their plan," said the judge. Johnny picked up the note again, reading those words once again. "Decide well, or your career will be the next to end." "What does this mean exactly?" Johnny asked. The judge sighed. "It means that if I gave any indication that the decisions were favoring you, my image would be destroyed, and yours along with it. So you stayed quiet." Johnny's voice was now colder. "Try," admitted the judge. "I didn't do anything. I kept quiet and continued with the process because I thought it would be the best way to keep myself safe and protect my family. You protected yourself and left me to face everything alone." The judge tried to respond, but stopped. He knew Johnny was right. Johnny sat back in his chair, thoughtful. For months, he had felt that something wasn't right during the trial, and now it all made sense. Those rumors spread in the media, the sensationalist headlines, the constant attempt to tarnish your image. Everything had been calculated from the beginning. And now, Johnny asked, "Why are you telling me this just now?" The judge looked at him, visibly shaken. "Because," He swallowed. I can no longer live with this guilt. Imagine discovering that someone who was supposed to be impartial and fair, someone who had the power to change your destiny in his hands, chose silence when you needed the truth most. This was the reality that Johnny Depp was facing. Now he knew that as he fought to clear his name, the judge, the same person who conducted his trial, was withholding information that could have changed everything. But what bothered Johnny most wasn't just what the judge did. It was what reason for which he had done it. The judge continued to sit in front of Johnny, visibly uncomfortable. The words had left his mouth, but it seemed like he was still trying to find justifications for what he did. I know it seems cowardly, he began, but you can't imagine the pressure I was under. Johnny kept his gaze fixed. He wasn't interested in excuses. I fought alone while you knew what was happening and said nothing. I know, replied the judge, almost in a whisper. And that's why I'm here now. Now, Johnny leaned forward. Now that I've already lost work. Now that my image has been dragged through the mud. Now that I had to fight to prove who I am. The judge lowered his head. I was afraid. Johnny took a deep breath. For months, he lived in true hell. He lost million-dollar contracts, was removed from important films, and saw his name being the target of relentless attacks in the media. He clearly remembered the moment he learned he would lose his iconic role as Jack Sparrow in the franchise Pirates of the Caribbean, a decision made by Disney before he even had the chance to publicly defend himself. And now, sitting in that cafe, he was hearing that maybe, just maybe, this decision could have been different if that judge had chosen to speak. Johnny felt deceived, betrayed, and, most of all, furious. You could have helped me. Johnny's voice was firm, but filled with hurt. The judge finally raised his head. And I know I made a mistake, he said, but I was afraid of losing everything. Johnny frowned. Lose everything? I have lost much more than you can imagine. The judge took a deep breath and, with a firmer tone of voice, tried to explain. I was being followed. I receive anonymous calls almost every day. The messages weren't just about me. They threatened my family too. Johnny looked at him, tried to identify if there was sincerity in his words. Those people wanted me to harm you, continued the judge. They weren't just pushing for me to give a favorable verdict to Amber. They wanted to destroy his image in any way. And you chose to protect yourself. Johnny interrupted. The judge nodded, embarrassed. I thought that if you kept quiet, you would still be able to defend yourself. Johnny shook his head slowly. You don't understand. When a lie is spread fast enough, the truth has to run twice as fast to catch up. The judge then revealed that, after the trial, the weight of guilt consumed him. I saw you lose jobs. I saw your name become a joke on social media, and I knew I could have said something sooner. Johnny was silent, absorbing every word. I tried to convince myself that you would end up winning anyway, the judge continued. But when I realized that they had turned the whole world against you, it was too late. The judge's voice began to crack. I screwed up, and I can't carry this guilt anymore. Johnny uncrossed his arms and placed his hands on the table. He knew the judge was sorry, but regret doesn't erase what happened. The judge looked directly into Johnny's eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said. I just wanted you to know the truth, and that I didn't act like this because I hated you or doubted you. I acted like this because he hesitated because I was a coward. Johnny took a deep breath. He could see that this man was sincere, but that didn't make things any easier. Now that you know, what are you going to do with it? Asked the judge. Johnny was silent for a few seconds and then replied, I still don't know. The judge slowly stood up, picked up his coat, and started walking towards the exit. But before leaving the cafe, he stopped and looked at Johnny one last time. I know you don't need to believe me, said the judge, but I hope that one day you understand that. I just wanted to protect who I love. Without waiting for a response, he walked out the door and disappeared onto the busy sidewalk. Johnny remained sitting, looking at the crumpled note on the table. He knew that meeting wouldn't change his past, but now he was certain. Someone tried to destroy it, and almost succeeded. But Johnny was still there, and this time, he would not let silence be stronger than the truth. Have you ever noticed that some truths only appear when it is too late to change the past? Johnny Depp knew that this meeting with the judge would not give back everything he had lost. The lies, attacks, and public humiliation had already left their mark. But now he understood that his greatest enemy wasn't just Amber Heard. It was the silence of someone who knew the truth and chose not to speak. Johnny was still sitting in the cafe, staring at the crumpled note the judge had left behind. The short but ominous message still echoed in his mind. Decide well, or your career will be the next to end. For months, Johnny fought to prove his innocence. He found himself thrust into the center of a media war where the truth was distorted and manipulated. He lost contracts, lost iconic roles like Jack Sparrow, was excluded from major productions, and saw his reputation shattered before the eyes of the world. And now, I knew part of that happened because the judge chose to remain silent. Johnny took a deep breath. He knew the judge was sorry, and that his silence came from fear. But this regret did not erase the fact that while he was treated as a villain, the judge had evidence in his hands that could have changed everything. And Johnny couldn't accept that. He thought of the fans who had always been by his side, those who defended his image when the entire world seemed convinced he was guilty. He thought about the friends who walked away, the brands that broke contracts with him without even questioning what was true or false. All of this because someone chose not to act. For a moment, Johnny thought about leaving it behind. He had already managed to prove his innocence in court, and little by little, he was rebuilding his career. But there was something he couldn't ignore. The lies that destroyed his life were still out there. The media that spread false headlines. The people who judged him without hearing his side of the story. Those who tried to force an outcome that favored Amber Heard. These people were still free. Johnny closed his eyes for a moment and then took a deep breath. He knew what he needed to do. He took the note, folded it carefully, and put it in his coat pocket. At that moment, he realized that the note was more than just a threat. It was a key piece that could change the way the public saw that entire story. Leaving the cafe, Johnny headed down the busy New York street. The cold breeze blew against his face, but his mind was steady. He was no longer thinking about the anger he felt towards the judge. He was no longer worried about what he had lost. Now, he only thought about one thing: justice. It was then that he muttered to himself, "I didn't hold a grudge, but it's good to know that, in the end, conscience always weighs heavily." That phrase, said only to himself, it wasn't a rant. It was a promise. Johnny knew there were people who still needed to be exposed. And now, he had what he needed to reveal the truth to the world. The judge tried to protect his image and his safety, but in doing so, he left Johnny to face an avalanche of lies alone. Now Johnny had made up his mind. No one would get away with it. The world had judged Johnny Depp based on a lie, but now he carried the greatest truth with him. He knew that some scars never fade, but I also knew that when the truth finally comes out, she can change everything. Now, I ask you, do you think Johnny Depp was right to move on, or should he have exposed everything immediately? Comment your opinion here. And if this story has stuck with you so far, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones.